Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name's David Carney. I'm the Executive Director of the Career Industry Council of Australia. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you for joining us as part of Global Careers Month. Just before we get underway today, I would just like to make an acknowledgement of country. So the Career Industry Council of Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. I'd like to acknowledge that this morning I'm hosting this webinar on the lands of the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway, just to let you know this session is being recorded. If you experience any technical issues over the course of the webinar, please just try refreshing your screen in the first instance. If that doesn't work, you can log out and come back in with the link that you have been provided. We will have the chat function open today, so feel free to add your comments and contributions to the chat. We'll also maybe have some time at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions for any of our presenters today, please feel free to put those into the Q&A. And just a reminder that AI note takers and audio and visual recording equipment is not permitted throughout the course of this session. Just a little bit of advertising. So we have one event left as part of our international webinar series, and that's on the 10th of December. So if you are interested in attending that session, please visit the Seeker website, click on the events tab, and you will be able to register for that event. So Global Careers Month is a worldwide initiative, and it's been led by an interagency global guidance working group. This is a collaboration of organisations, CETAFOP, the European Commission, the ETF, the ILO, the OECD, UNESCO and the World Bank. And throughout November, this whole month, the international organisations are working together with partners across the globe to highlight the role of career guidance in empowering people to build meaningful lives and careers. Today's webinar reflects that mission by exploring how career development can support refugees and migrants in resettling, rebuilding their career identities and contributing their talents within these new communities in Australia. Here in Australia, the Career Industry Council of Australia is proud to play a leading role in a regional focal point for the Oceania region as part of Global Careers Month. We're committed to showcasing innovative work being done across our region, strengthening national conversations about career development and advocating for policy and systems that support every citizen at every stage of their life. As we gather today, we do recognise the importance of inclusive career development approaches that value the unique strengths, aspirations and cultural backgrounds of all people. This especially is critical in supporting refugees and migrants as they start to build their futures here in Australia. As part of Global Careers Month, there was a new version of that Investing in Career Guidance publication, which has been published. You can find it on the Seeker website. If you click on the news tab, you'll be able to find that. If you're interested in any further events as part of Global Careers Month, you can go to the skillsforemployment.org/IAG event page, and you'll be able to find information on all of the events that are happening throughout November as part of Global Careers Month. So it's time to kick our session off today. We have 4 presenters joining us as part of our webinar, and I'll introduce them as each of them present. I'll be bringing in Nancy Arthur, who's our first presenter today. Nancy would be probably familiar with some of you. She's been a regular presenter at our international webinar series, and it's great to have her back as part of our Global Careers Month event. Nancy is Dean Research for UniSA's Business and the College of Business and Law at the New Adelaide University, and she's a Professor Emerita at the University of Calgary. Her internationally recognised research examines cultural-infused career counselling and the transition experiences of international students and migrants. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you very much, David, and hello to panelists as well. So I'll just share my screen before I begin. Yeah, can you confirm, David, that you can see that?
It all looks perfect, Nancy.
All right, thank you. Well, I just want to express my appreciation to Sika for organizing and sponsoring this webinar, as it's a really, really important topic, and one that we need to highlight and consider what resources can be put forward, supporting refugee resettlement through career development. And I'll have some ideas to offer for this topic. I'm particularly interested in hearing the presentations from Sally, John, and Payman. And I hope together we'll offer some ideas for around where we are and where we need to go. I also want to acknowledge I'm joining you today from the city of Adelaide in Australia. And I want to acknowledge the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respects to elders past and present. I do so in recognizing the importance of spiritual and historical connections to land and place of the Kaurna people and other First Nations of Australia. And I want to acknowledge this importance to Indigenous people throughout the world. So some of the topics that I want to address in a brief 10-minute presentation, I'll just begin with a couple of notes on the context of migration, specifically focused on humanitarian and refugee populations. But I want to really frame my comments today around why career development matters and make the case that we have to really think beyond initial job placement to supporting sustainable careers. In doing so, I think we've got some work to do and really exciting work that we can continue around interdisciplinary approaches. We have to consider a policy focus and what role that professional associations and practitioners can play in advocacy. So that's how I'll spend my 10 minutes, and I do really welcome questions and comments as I progress. Okay, so just by way of background, as of June 2024, there were more than 122 million people who had been forcibly displaced around the world. And I think this global context is really important information because what's happening in other parts of the world really influences the mobility and migration of various populations. So of that number, that includes more than 40 million refugees, asylum seekers, and persons who are stateless and in need of international protection. Not all will receive that protection. But now we have not only people who cross countries, but I think in a global sense, we have to think about internally displaced people who need to move from within their countries. And those individuals will be represented maybe in future statistics, maybe not, many of whom will need to flee their countries or move elsewhere, but will not have that opportunity. So many displaced people move to neighboring countries who are often classified by low or middle income countries who frankly are struggling to resource the large numbers of populations who are seeking refuge, who need places to regroup, relive, resettle, with the hope perhaps of returning to countries, but often that is not possible. So I want to turn to what's called high-income countries and consider what responsibilities they have. And in that conversation, it's really about what responsibilities we have in high-income countries, such as Canada, United States, and Australia, as the three top resettlement countries for persons requiring humanitarian migration. So Australia has had an annual program kind of target, I'll say, target visa targets of around 20,000 people for a number of years. That was disrupted during COVID. Those targets were not met. And you see the backlog of applications that go over time. So the 2024 to 2025 target remains at 20,000, and we will see what actual numbers materialize. But this is more than numbers. It's really about which people, under what circumstances, are given visas, okay, through formal applications, and which persons actually arrive in country. I want to point out that we are aiming in Australia for a really critical milestone. And this is an important statistic. By next year, we anticipate that there will be a milestone of 1 million humanitarian visas, people who have come to Australia on humanitarian visas since 1947. I raise that point because it's not only what we do in any one year, but cumulative. We have 1 million people across the land who have settled in Australia and will be settling in Australia. Our neighbors, our students, our colleagues, members of community organizations whose lives have been enveloped for sometimes up to a year, but sometimes many years and intergenerations of living in settlement countries. All right, now, just before we go too far, David, I can't tell if that screen is covering content. Can I move that, or can you? There, maybe I do that, okay? A refugee, let's just spend a minute on terminology. So officially, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country due to well-founded fears of persecution. This is very different than migrants who voluntarily, and I recognize there's a spectrum between voluntary and involuntary, but have been proactive and intentional about migrating to other countries, but often based because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership, or intersections of those factors, need to move because of safety reasons. And they're not able to return to their home country because of fear of prosecution. So this is a fear-based and involuntary upheaval of persons' circumstances. So we have to look at the underpinning issues of forced displacement, the movement between countries, the fear of reprisal, and lack of state protection. These are the key factors that lead individuals to seek official status and migration to other countries as refugees. Now, employment matters, and I want to emphasize this. So often what we see, I'm going to move us away here, often what we see is a focus on the initial transition. Well, the transition actually starts way before people arrive in Australia. These factors I just described are ongoing and threats in the home country before people arrive. But we often emphasize on that initial transition when people arrive. How do we help refugees to set up in that initial transition and settlement in the country? So primarily during that initial time, there are priorities for security, safety, access to affordable housing, trying to settle an income. And these are all going on within the space of how people are feeling and doing. So funding frameworks often extend for about a year, and then funding is gradually or completely withdrawn in various country contexts. But I emphasize how important employment is as the basis for how people fare in those other domains. So in other words, employment is the key to positive integration. It's through employment that people feel secure. It's through employment that people are able to provide for their families. It's through employment that people develop networks and feel like they are part of a community. Now, I want to argue, though, that we have to go beyond job placement. We have to actually take a close look at job placement and the types of jobs that we are supporting refugees to enter in that initial transition. There's huge pressure both on refugees and the services available to refugees to get people working. And this can mean some mismatches in skill levels and credential levels. And working with many refugee clients over the years, they feel very pressured to accept any employment. Now, the issue here can be for, are we matching to skill level, and how long should people wait, and what resources would be available to them to make sure that there's commensurate employment commensurate with their actual qualifications. Of course, many people flee their countries without documentation of those credentials. Career development is an investment, and this is an investment both on the short term and long term. So as we go through this cycle, I'd like us to think about not the initial transition, but to think about how do we actually support the multiple and multi-layered career transitions that refugees will face, not upon immediate arrival, but over their life course of living in Australia or other destination countries. So career development matters on multiple levels. So we want to think about what are the benefits of providing a broader base and a longer term approach to supporting refugees with their career development. Well, one argument, and I think this is an important one, is that we increase human capital. In other words, we actually have to be able to provide a rationale as to why career development matters. If we can increase the human capital potential, some people might think about this as employability of refugees. They're going to be able to work in different ways and at different levels commensurate with their actual qualifications. Now, in a country right now that's talking a lot about productivity, I think the human capital argument is a strong one. In other words, the more we can do to help individuals and families to be working at a fuller capacity, this helps them, but it also helps it makes an economic argument. It's also really important for community integration because where we work has a big impact about what we can do in our communities, what other kinds of contributions that we can make in settlement. It affects longer-term wage growth. If you look at the trajectories of people's income from initial settlement over long-term, the level in the labor market at which they're working has a big implication for how much income they have over the long term. What I'm suggesting here also is that we have to address and overcome labor market segregation. And my graphic kind of shows this. Too often, refugees, and particularly unskilled refugees, are working in the part of the labor market where often many local people will not work. And the time and energy they are putting into those jobs makes it very difficult, particularly without training support, to move to other parts of the labor market. While oftentimes, the work on refugees is focused on one individual, we have to think about refugees in context of family and intergenerational issues. Career development for adult refugees is really important because it has intergenerational issues for youth. In a 3-country study that I'm involved with in Australia, Canada, and the United States, we interviewed youth and their parents around what their aspirations were for the future and what help they were receiving. Youth between 18 and 24, many of our participants in that study were refugees, talked about their ambitions for the future, their help seeking, and how important it was that parents had knowledge and that persons they're in contact with in school systems had really great knowledge to help them. It's not a lack of will, it's really an issue of how best we support and take a more holistic view of career development for refugees and their families. So what would make a difference and what can we do? Well, number one point I want to say is that we need to work in collaboration. And this means not making decisions on behalf of refugees, but making sure they are active stakeholders in any decisions and programs we offer. But it's time that we shift the narrative from historical narratives around deficits and drain to really looking at a strength-based capacity building approach. So if we look at, if we really truly invested in capacity building, both directly with refugees and their families, as well as the practitioners that serve them, we might have a different picture in 10 years. In fact, there's research that supports the billions of dollars that could be improved in the economy if refugees were working, if refugees were working at a fuller capacity. And this requires career development. So I do want to focus on the network and the web of support around refugees, because while I do believe that training and skill development is really important for them, it's not just up to them. It's very important that they have access to well-qualified and trained career development practitioners who not only know things about career development, but are very have a background in understanding some of the issues facing refugees as they transition into new country contexts. That happens within settlement agencies, but it also happens in the community, where we have many citizens working directly with refugees who have terrific experience in communities and with employment, but may not have the background in career development that could augment their actual work directly with refugees. We have to look at funding commitments that often are precarious, short-term, and competitive within and between agencies where settlement activity occurs. We also need to engage with employers and a fuller range of employers of what benefits and opportunities they would have by employing people who have been displaced in the short term and long term from other countries. This will require interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think that's our best way of going, where we have people with different expertise coming together from different points of engagement in communities. Researchers, practitioners, community folks who can come together working and with professional associations who can work together, but also contribute to an evidence base about what works and what makes a difference. Engagement with policy is so important because if we look at directions, it's not just about bringing in numbers or the statistics of year. It's really about what resources are afforded for supporting the career development of refugees. We're seeing on a worldwide stage anti-migration narratives that are affecting policy commitments across various countries that disrupt funding availability, that contest the number of people we're receiving, and often leave the support being very short term. We need to make a very clear commitment and help policymakers to see the importance of following through. So I'm very pleased that SICA has started with this webinar, and because professional associations have a very strong role for creating strategic agendas. So I just want to add a reference from which some of the ideas from this presentation were made, of which John and Payman and Mary McMahon were part of. Thank you, David, and I'm very happy to start there, and I would welcome your questions or questions in the chat.
Thank you, Nancy, very much. I think we might just, if anyone's got any questions, they might put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and Nancy will be able to answer those directly. I'm just conscious of time, and I just want to make sure that Payman and John and Sally have an opportunity to share their views as well. But it was a great way to sort of kick us off, Nancy, so thank you very much. It sort of provided a wonderful grounding of where we're looking to head today. I'll bring Payman in now, Payman is a lecturer in the School of Applied Psychology at Griffith University. His research focuses on culturally responsive career development and strengthening social inclusion for migrants and people from refugee backgrounds. He is widely published and contributes to leading international journals. Payman, welcome to our webinar today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, David. And I also want to thank Nancy for that beautiful introduction and opening of the session, which sets a very beautiful ground, I think, for the context of global migration, forced displacement, and refugees. What I am doing here today is that I'm kind of extending that upon what Nancy laid a foundation and moving more towards a more practical space where career practitioners and career counselors navigate with refugees, and I try to be a bit more short when I talk about context. But there's a little bit of a nuanced background that I just want to touch. So again, there are some overlapping content here in the first slide that I'm just mindful. So let me begin by situating this discussion within the global context of forced migration. And as of April this year, we have over 122 million forcibly displaced people globally. And interestingly, this number has almost doubled in the past decade. What I want to draw your attention to is that many of those forcibly displaced people who are resettled through the UNHCR program and the ones who come to Australia are predominantly coming through this program, come from collectivist cultures of Africa and Asia. And in these cultures, everyday life and conversations are intertwined with the storytelling. And we must note that while most of these resettled refugees have gone through protracted displacement, meaning that they have been in limbo in transitory countries, sometimes for more than a decade. Now, what happens in protracted displacement is important for us to consider, as it is in this context that people start to feel alienated and isolated because of the inability to access many of the taken for granted rights and opportunities that we have. And even the people who live in those transitory countries have, but these refugees don't have access to, those taken for granted things such as access to education, access to, even basic employment. So they get more and more distanced from the preferred accounts of identities. That's what I call it. These spaces, they start to lose access to their usual story about who they are as a person, about who they used to see themselves as capable of, and what sort of things they were able to do, or who they perceived themselves to be, and what sort of person, what sort of skills, what sort of capabilities, or even interests they have. So they gradually get more and more distant from those knowledges, leaving them in a state that we often call a state of in-betweenness or uncertainty, and not only about future, but also about who they actually are and who they wish to be. So now, talking about narrative career counseling, that's what I'm trying to do here. So based on this foundation, I also want to say that let's recognize that a lot of traditional and Western individualized models of career counseling that prevail in our field usually fall short when working with refugee clients. These models often assume autonomy, self-direction, and linear decision-making, assumptions that may not always fully align with the lived realities, some of which I just outlined, of people with refugee backgrounds and those especially from collectivist cultures. So in such contexts, career decisions are rarely made in isolation by the individual, family, community. That sense of relational embeddedness often plays a central role. If you're not careful, standard test and tell approaches may risk imposing those linear pathways that miss the complex interconnected layers of the decision making, or sometimes worse, unintentionally operate from a deficit-based perspective where the client's struggles are more framed as personal limitations, inabilities, rather than as adaptive responses to the broader structures and cultural realities that they have been navigating. So what refugees often carry is not just a CV gap, but that psychological exhaustion that comes, that interrupted sense of identity or sense of being suspended between worlds of possibility and impossibility. Yeah, so when career counseling leans too heavily on those traditional models, it risks losing touch with the social justice values that also underpin our field, those that we always sort of implicitly have in our mind. So this is where narrative career counseling and systems theory framework, I think, work very well together. And narrative career counseling helps clients reclaim agency by exploring and reauthoring their personal or relational stories. At the same time, system thinking zooms out, helping both the client and practitioner, the career counselor, map those broader sociocultural factors that shape their stories, their sense of identity, including the barriers and challenges, as well as the contextual characteristics such as the family influences or cultural norms and so on. So I think together these frameworks resist those quick fix answers. They kind of create a space for validation, care, mattering, and sustaining a long-term vision for the person. And that's crucial because effective career counseling with refugees isn't just about finding the next job. As Nancy was saying, it's more about restoring that sense of future, a belief in the self as someone who can shape the future. And that's the lens I'm predominantly working and emphasizing today, the complementarity between narrative career counseling and systems thinking. And yeah. Let me move the slide. Okay. So just briefly on narrative career counseling, it's obviously grounded in that belief that people make sense of their lives through stories. So it emphasizes the facilitation of a storytelling in counseling sessions, because basically the aim becomes that of inviting clients to tell us stories, construct new stories about who they are, sometimes bring things from the margin, and reconstruct new life narratives with a focus on preferred personal meanings and subjectivities that some of them might have been inaccessible by the person at this point. So through storytelling, the practitioner ideally should help the person articulate how past, present experiences or future plans and expectations also intersect. Okay, while validating both their suffering and how they face challenges, as well as the unique personal qualities, strengths, and skills that they have. For many people with refugee background, this is the role of family, community is also acknowledged. They can share stories about those relational embeddedness, that we know how a lot of their stories about self are intertwined with stories of their relationship with others, role models, significant people, family members, and even how the community kind of imposes certain expectations. So in practice, acknowledging complexity means that career support must be culturally humble and contextualized, and this is what the complementarity between narrative work and system thinking provides. Now here, the system thinking also becomes crucial because the practitioner keep in mind that all these stories that the client is sort of telling and reconstructing unfold within those intricate and overlapping networks of influence, as I mentioned, family, community, education, even their socioeconomic status, policies of multiple migration contexts. So not just policies of the host country and the final country of destination, but also the policies of transitory context or their country of origin that might have imposed certain understandings about work and so on. So just a little bit on systems theory, introducing systems theory framework of career development, the work of Wendy Patton and Mary McMahon. So alongside narrative career counseling, this systems thinking that comes from SDF when supporting refugees is highlighted. So SDF gives us this dynamic map of the many interconnected influences that shapes the person's career development. And it places obviously the individual in the middle of three interconnecting systems. The first is the intrapersonal system, things like a person's values, interests, skills, personality, things that have been predominantly historically pretty much highlighted in the career psychology and career development field. Then we have social systems, family, peers, school, community, workplace, even media, religious institutions. Those networks are particularly important in collectivist cultures, as I highlighted, where career choices are also often shaped in relation to other people, to others. And then we have the broader environmental societal system, including government policy, economic conditions, labor market circumstances or trends, and global migration systems, and even dominant sort of rhetoric at any point in time that shape various resources and opportunities. So what's important here is that these systems don't stand still. They're not static. They are constantly changing and also interacting and influencing each other. And that is why we have in the SDF, we have three other systems, the more process-oriented systems that are dynamic, like change over time, as you can see in the graph here. We have change over time, chance, and recursivity, which is the interaction between all elements of the system. So when working with refugees, the SDF offers a nuanced way to understand their career journeys. It reminds us that people's life stories aren't unfolding in isolation, not individual stories, that their aspirations and decisions are continually shaped by those overlapping personal, but also social and structural forces, many of them beyond their control. So instead of relying on models that treat the individual in isolation to focus narrowly or focus narrowly on decision making, the SDF wants to invite us to see people in relationship with their environment and social context. And the shift allows us to move from simply asking, what job fits this person, which has been the prevailing question that a lot of career practitioners are asking, to what is structural barriers are shaping or limiting the opportunities that are relevant for this person at this point in time, and how these broader forces shaped their sense of identity, and what is my task as a practitioner in coming in, and sort of what role can I play here. And it also prompts us to ask how we as practitioners can support clients to navigate these complex contexts, and which voices, which stories might have been marginalized, um, and and they need to be more actively heard. Some stories need to be more heard, more supported, and that's why the SDF and narrative career counseling work so well together. I think one helps the clients reclaim meaning and agency through storytelling, and the other helps us to see how those stories are shaped by larger systems. And just to conclude, I'd remind us that refugees don't make career decisions in a vacuum. I think that point has already been made today, that their pathways are influenced by personal traits and aspirations, yeah, but also by the limiting context of often protracted migration journey and its policies, interrupted schoolings, lack of access to work, family influences, but also family obligations, the collectivist cultures, the community norms, and all that. So the SDF is that tool now that helps us map this complexity, all right? And by bringing this into the counseling room, what we begin to facilitate is what we might call systemic stories or systemic storytelling facilitation, that narratives that weave the personal with the societal and the structural are highlighted. And they help clients not only identify their own values or strengths or skills, but to understand that these have been shaped by and respond to broader sociocultural or political realities. And that synthesis of narratives and systems helps us shift away from asking only what should this person do next, to deeper, more ethical, justice-oriented questions like what has shaped this person's current story, or what influences have constrained or supported them, what possibilities, what new stories can now emerge or needs attention. Yeah, thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Payman, very much. It's always a challenge having to condense passionate work into 10 minutes. So I thank you for doing that. It now gives me great pleasure to bring John into the conversation. John would be familiar with some of you probably through his work at James Cook University for many years. But for those of you that don't know, John is an assistant professor in counselling psychology at the University of Victoria in Canada, where he's now returned to. He is an adjunct lecturer at James Cook University and a registered psychologist. His research centres on international career transition and supporting newcomers to build meaningful and sustainable careers. And it's great to actually have John in the country for this presentation. He's recently arrived from Canada and he's in Sydney, a little bit jet lagged probably, but nothing better to beat jet lag than a presentation for Seeker. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Nancy and Payman, for setting the context here and moving us into practice notes. I'm excited to talk about systemic barriers and training opportunities and how we can work with them to support the career development field and practitioners to support refugees. So to get us all in the mindset of where systemic barriers and training opportunities might meet, I was reminded of an experience that I had while I was working in a post-secondary counseling center. I had met with a student from a refugee background who was referred to me by counseling services team for mental health concerns. And what stood out to me was that the client was confused why she had been referred to me when her main focus was preparing to transition to the workforce. So the client shared with me that she didn't seem able to engage with the career content from career services, and it wasn't that she wasn't motivated or that she didn't find the content relevant. But I came to understand that she was experiencing trauma responses. And so what was challenging was that she presented in a very collected way in session. And so without training to understand trauma responses, you wouldn't necessarily understand what the disconnection was. And all of this was creating an invisible barrier that was keeping my client from accessing the career services that she deserved. So one way to think of this is that we've got parallel tracks. And on one track, we have people from refugee backgrounds who are in need of both jobs that support survival, but also deserve to have quality career development support for their long-term well-being. They also have highly diverse life experiences and pathways to Australia, requiring very careful consideration and sometimes specialized approaches. On the other track, you have career development practitioners who have the tools, knowledge, and experience to support that long-term career development, but often they are not part of that initial or ongoing supports for people from refugee backgrounds. Moreover, when refugees are able to access career development practitioners, often the practitioners do not have specific training background to work effectively with the intersections of that highly diverse life experience, including, like in my example, the potential trauma experiences. So in order for long-term career change, we need to find a way to make these tracks meet so that refugees can transfer from just initial placement to more long-term career development. But let's take a step back here and briefly look at a small selection of key systemic barriers that refugees can face in their long-term career development, and then we'll connect them to training opportunities. So first, resettlement supports, which are critical to the initial transition of refugees to their new home, they often have to prioritize placement into jobs, and this is an essential service because our society is structured around work to survive. However, what often happens is that unfortunately, that in that initial placement, refugees are put into placements that are convenient because it is expedient, and there isn't as much time for that depth of career exploration and alignment in the next steps for a long-term career pathway. So these positions are rightly called survival jobs and are a function largely of metrics of resettlement agencies. This is something Nancy talked about. And it's in part because we have broad social assumptions that refugees are or should just be happy to be here and accept whatever they can as soon as possible to get off of social supports. So the issue is that often these positions are not connected to career pathways that align with their education, previous experience, or capability. And at least historically, they've also experienced systemic barriers around credentials not being recognized and the lack of bridging programs, although we're starting to see more of those. So then compare that to professional disconnection. So career development practitioners are not typically integrated into settlement services, and ongoing supports for refugees are usually on an ad hoc basis or an adjunct part of supports. They're not the focus of supports. So then professionals working in resettlement agencies, they often do not have as extensive training in career development and are sometimes volunteers or people from refugee backgrounds themselves who are working based off of their lived experiences getting jobs. Moreover, in a recent scoping review that my colleagues and I completed looking at trauma-informed career counseling, what we found was that a lot of the articles were talking about anything related to trauma being outside of the scope of practice, and that the default sort of best standard was to make referrals. And so it's important to know that not all refugees experience trauma responses, however, many do. So then career development practitioners are not part of the initial transition. They may not be part of the long-term job placement, and they're disconnected from providing supports sometimes because training may not meet the needs of the refugee client in the moment. So overall, what this can look like is a revolving door where refugees cycle through survival jobs while career practitioners are sidelined from intervening for meaningful change. Okay, So then what if we look at career practitioners in a more integrated way as embedded in resettlement services and ongoing supports for refugees? And this is the invitation that I'm putting out to you all to shift our perspectives and see where we as a field can engage in this work differently to perhaps address some of these systemic barriers, possibly through our own training opportunities. So before we continue, take a moment to reflect on your training. For example, what was your training to work in a trauma-informed way? If you were working with the client I introduced at the beginning, would you feel competent in working with her? Keep these in mind as we move forward. So one way that we can start addressing some of these systemic barriers is through what career programs might be missing. So for example, refugee-specific modules. Here, looking at forced migration and trauma experiences that might be related to that, often these concepts, if they are covered, are distilled more simplistically into transitions or new to the country, doesn't look as much at the ongoing personal well-being influences and past experiences. For experiential learning, practitioners do need exposure to refugee contexts to build skills. So, for example, this might be key to managing trauma response through trauma-informed career development practice. And then for systemic literacy, what we have is training often focuses on the individual, as Payman was talking about, and not structural advocacy. So, how do we bring in employers? But also, how do we work at a more broader social level so that we get the resourcing that we need to work long term with refugees? So, we're nearing the end of my time, and I want this discussion to continue. So, I'm going to leave you with some calls to action here. One of them is we need to work together to embed career practitioners into multidisciplinary resettlement teams. So, advocacy from career development associations with governmental bodies and nonprofits to help align and make aware of the surface provision and access to career development practitioners. So, if these initial placements can be serving refugees both in the initial transition period as well as their long term needs, then we're already shifting career trajectories early. Next, we need to think about developing specialized training streams focused on career development. So, on refugee career development, sorry. So, for example, in the counseling program I teach in, we include a career counseling component, and all of our courses are set up to develop trainees' ability to engage in trauma-informed practice, regardless of the population people are working with, the context they're working in, or the concerns that come up. We also want to think about promoting cross-profession collaboration. So instead of independent practices across career services, social work, mental health, education, and policy, how do we find ways to integrate practices so that we're avoiding this hot potato referral that seems to happen where the person's career concerns are not met? And then finally, how do we have social and casual discourses and conversations with our families and friends to debunk misinformation and refocus narratives so that we can get funding metrics to change to support us being able to work with refugees to support long-term career development? You can see David signaling it's the end of my time. Here are some key references. It was great to speak with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for your contribution. I love the way that each of our presenters has obviously come at a different angle in presenting, and I'm going to bring Sally in now. And Sally is probably Payman and Nancy and John have worked together on a paper which I've put in the chat. Sally's probably new to the seeker scene, and I can see lots of nodding, which means that she's obviously agreeing with this thing that she's hearing about career development. So that's always positive. Sally's the CEO and founder of Refugee Education Australia, and she's the co-lead of the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway. As a research affiliate with the Calder Centre for International Refugee Law, she advocates for equitable higher education pathways for students from refugee and forced migration backgrounds. Sally, welcome. It's great to have you with us. I know you've recently developed a resource which I'm sure a lot of our attendees are going to be interested in hearing about as well. So I'm going to pass over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to share the panel with Nancy, Payman, and John, whose work I have read and referenced. Not the new piece, Nancy, that you shared, so that's great. Yeah, as David said, I'm Sally, and I have had my own career shift recently. I was an associate professor of migration and education at the ANU, but I stepped away from there earlier this year and have uncomfortably found myself in the position of CEO. Not a lot of academic characteristics of the academic role that cross over easily, but I think I'm not going to say that David Carney's a genius, but I think this is a really clever way of setting up the panel, because Nancy and Payman and John have really set out the kind of context. John talking about practical intervention, and I'm going to talk about something that has been co-designed, but then I'm going to end with some practical solutions, I think, that respond to what Nancy, Payman and John have said before. So I'm going to talk about a culturally responsive online employability resource that was designed for all of the reasons that we've heard, in terms of, kind of lack of acknowledgement in many of the employability modules or models that include migration, let alone forced migration. And Refugee Education Australia is very much interested in education, but not as a means to its end. So we are really also interested in meaningful employment. And this work came out of a previous piece of work, both funded by Access, or then NSHE, the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success, but previously the National Centre for Student Equity. This was a project that was born out of some frustration on my end about how little attention is paid to this particular cohort in many facets and aspects of higher education. And it was meant to be a randomized control trial. And I'm laughing because it's actually impossible to do a randomized control trial collecting primary data within the higher education sector. I could spend 2 hours talking about why that was an issue, but what I'm going to do is tell you today about the co-design of an employability module that really worked with, so it was co-designed with people with forced migration experience and career practitioners and a whole bunch of really excellent humans. It was due to be trialled at 8 universities. Sadly, because the sector has been on fire, that was whittled down to 6 universities. During the co-design process, we sadly had 2 redundancies from our team. And of course, we know that when there is a change management process, it will be student-facing support staff that go first. And it was certainly the case in 2 universities that were our original partners at the careers teams were also hit first. So I think that's an important context, because there's loads of things we could do. There's loads of things that, for example, universities should do. But actually, when things are really challenging financially, it's difficult to make a case for a lot more resourcing. So we were lucky to get this funding to co-design this project with a view to it being a large randomized control trial. There's a story about why that didn't work. But my primary intention was to co-design this great resource to try and kind of respond to some of the things that Nancy Payman and John have said in terms of designing something that's fit for purpose and that's built with young people with lived experience of forced migration. We co-designed with loads of people. So we had, importantly, we had a kind of co-design group of students with lived experience of forced migration and who were currently studying. We had 2 career experienced people with lived experience who also came on board. We conducted 4 co-design workshops around the appreciative inquiry model, so very much a strengths-based model, going back to Nancy's original point, that asks you to dream and then design and then deliver. So we've been able to go through, I've missed a D out, there's 4 Ds. So we were able to go through that whole process, and we designed something that we had initially hoped would be in person. The sector told us, and colleagues in those universities said, this isn't going to work, we can't fit this into our programming. So it ended up being an online resource and a self-paced resource. We've tried to gamify it, and we brought in loads of people from not just universities, but also from the sector. So we had the Resettlement Council of Australia, we had Save the Children, we had Mayan, we had CDAA, we had NAGCAS. I'm sure we had a representative seeker on there as well, David. We had Ready Grad and Wise Employment as well, and career seekers, really importantly, with that kind of very focused refugee work placement employment lens. And we ended up designing an online resource which is called Your Story, Your Career. I don't love that title, so I'm open to feedback if anyone's got any ideas of what a better name might be. And this was all based around Tomlinson's graduate capitals model. And I'm sure colleagues are aware of the graduate capitals model. Helps us to kind of move beyond human capital, but I do agree with Nancy that is, it's often the most seductive and useful capital and narrative to kind of make kind of claims or certainly requests for support and funding, or replace in a suite of resources. But what we know about forced migration, and we know about that dislocation and the dislocation of networks and familiarity with systems, is that it's often social and cultural capitals that need a bit more kind of working. The previous project before this one kind of analysed some career practitioner and student data, and showed that really at universities at least, the primary focus was on human capital development. There wasn't much that was equity specific, so it wasn't cohort specific. And it was really down to that kind of resource pressure that means that, universities and colleagues are having to make very difficult decisions with limited resources. So we built this resource around the graduate capitals model. We mapped out the capitals. This is just a quick snapshot. There's a lot more complicated, messy mapping in the back end, and we created 6 modules. What we were trying to do was to make this truly culturally responsive. Now, what does culturally responsive mean? That's a bit of a kind of thorny question, but we were trying to bring in both the voices of, the accounts of, and the kind of the characteristics of forced migration, in terms of recognizing that there are things that you don't know if you're new to a country, exactly what Nancy Payman and John have spoken to already. And we also tried to build in some of that kind of tacit information about, things like the hidden job market, and, how to present yourself in a way that that shows confidence and not arrogance, and some of the pieces around telling story. So I think, Payman, I'll be having a look at systems theory framework and systemic stories, and looking to kind of make sense of what we found with that theory. It makes a lot of sense to me. We then, because the RCT didn't work, and we really did throw our best effort at it, and a shout out to my colleague Tim, who's in the room here, who did so much of the work in trying to corral those universities and try and get that to happen. Very micro account is that the ethics process of reciprocal ethics didn't line up, data sharing wasn't possible, recruitment processes are a hot nightmare, so it just made the whole RCT idea a bit of a challenge. Instead, we did some user experience evaluation. We asked 24 peer career supporters to go through the resource, and there were kind of linked prompts in there so that we could capture real-time feedback on what was working and what wasn't working in terms of the whole module. So some of the feedback is very much about accessibility and pace, but some of it, and the focus was that we were interested in, was that question of cultural responsiveness. So some of the kind of feedback that we got was that students recognise that we'd really tried hard to capture specific challenges for students culturally and linguistically marginalised. We used this term, it doesn't work. I really wish we hadn't. I don't know that students recognise themselves with this term. So I think there's an interesting piece about terminology in here as well. Refugee, student from refugee background, person with lived experience of forced migration, they're all problematic in all sorts of different ways. And again, I think you could have a whole panel on the question of what language to use. But students, our peer career support user experience participants really liked the representation of refugee alumni in video testimonials, which was supported by career seekers. They liked the self-reflection on their identity and strengths and values, and being able to tell their story in a way that was positive and strengths framed, rather than having to kind of excuse some of the deficits that they might have kind of perceived that they needed to account for. We really tried hard to promote an integration rather than an assimilation lens. We agree, of course, that a lot of this needs to be kind of framed and supported by employer awareness, and that kind of training piece that John talked about is just so important. And this is a kind of vehicle, I think, or the intention was that this would be a vehicle for doing some of that work. I can certainly share a version of this. We're currently working with that user experience data to refine, and then I'll go through quickly because I'm conscious of time. So we've got lots of kind of components in, very much built by the career developers with an educational designer, with that input from our other colleagues in the lived experience panels. So our next steps are, number one, we're going to do this refinement piece. So we really are working with the user experience data, and we're thinking about how we can tweak. We don't have the funds to rebuild, and there's lots of things you could do if you had sufficient time and without the pressure of an RCT hanging over you. We're going to distribute, when that's done, we'll distribute the LMS code and instructions for universities across the country. So every table A university will be invited to add this resource into their LMS. It is a difficult time to ask for additional supports, but we'd love this to be augmented with an interactive kind of peer-to-peer or certainly facilitated kind of workshop piece alongside the online resource. Again, not an easy time to ask for that. Certainly for Refugee Education Australia, we'll be hosting this on our website as well so that the reach is as far as possible, because my view very much, and I think it aligns exactly with what John was saying, is that settlement caseworkers don't have this knowledge. In general, there is a definite training need, and that's something that Refugee Education Australia will be responding to next year. We'll be putting some of those kind of professional workshops together. First one will be trauma-informed research for students and supervisors, because that's definitely a missing piece in the HDR lens, but we're certainly looking to kind of develop professional learning opportunities that help to leverage this kind of knowledge. So we'll be hosting the resource on our Canvas site as well. We're setting up a new community of practice with career seekers. We'd love to have the Seeker logo on this as well, and we're certainly looking to try and extend and continue this conversation with folks working in the career space and with settlement organisations. I'm working with an organisation in Tasmania at the moment, and they are developing a career navigator program. So it's not that it's not happening, it's just that it's not funded within the existing settlement funding models. And I'd love you to check out the resources on the Refugee Education Australia website. There we have a huge 800 page open access annotated bibliography. It definitely has some of John Payman and Nancy's previous contributions in there. It's open access and you can just download it from our website. You could use the ARID, the Australian Research into Refugee Integration database, which is a searchable database when you can look for Australian careers, and you could look for particular cohorts. And as I said, we'll have the Your Story, Your Career module. You could also, cheeky, you could also consider joining us and becoming a member of Refugee Education Australia. This is absolutely our bread and butter. We are completely committed to working across the educational spectrum, across from early childhood to higher ed, but with meaningful employment and skilled refugee labour as key areas that we're interested in. So very happy to share a version of that resource once it's been refined through Seeker. And I know we're out of time, but happy to answer any questions after if anyone wants to contact us. It's refugee-education.org.au. And that's it.
Thank you, Sally, very much. I've put the URL into the chat for everybody, so they'll be able to find you. I'm just conscious of time. I think we're probably about 5 minutes over. I know a lot of people have put sort of messages in that they've had to run. So apologies that we've run a little bit over time today, but I think everybody will agree that it's been a really valuable session. Sally, I might just ask you to stop sharing your screen. That's okay. So I can bring everybody everybody back in and just sort of say, look, on behalf of, not only on behalf of the Career Industry Council, but as part of the start of Global Careers Month, I think it's been such a valuable session to shine a light on what I think all of you have agreed is sometimes an area where there's not enough attention focused to. I think, Sally, you hit the nail on the head when you sort of said, when times are tough and funding is difficult, it is that front service facing programs that do tend to disappear. And I think I agree with what Nancy was saying earlier too. We are unfortunately living in a period at the moment where we are fighting against a push about anti-migration right across the globe. So it makes that even more difficult again. But I think from where all of you sit, and also from where Seeker sits as an organisation, from a social justice perspective, I think, we very much believe that, career development has such an important role to play in supporting refugee transition and migration transition. And we can all, obviously, I think it takes all of us to work together in a more cohesive way, coming at it, at government from various different angles to make sure that, these people are supported in our community. So on behalf of Seeker, thank you, Nancy, Payman, John and Sally. Sally, thanks for your comment. I'm not sure it was deliberate, the way that the order was set up, but it does seem to have worked well today, the way that we've sort of flowed through. So thank you for that. And thank you for those people that have joined us today. As I said, we have one session left as part of the international webinar series in December. If you're interested in that, feel free to register for that. A recording of this webinar will be made available and sent out to everybody that registered. We will also put this on our Seeker YouTube channel because we do believe it's an important message that needs to continue to be shared. So feel free to share that as well. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you to our panelists again. It's a great way to kick off Global Careers Month. Have a wonderful week and an enjoyable afternoon for those on the Eastern Seaboard. Thanks everybody.